Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of Northshire Presents online version. I am, for those of you who don't know me, Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Here, as I so often am these days, with my friend and colleague, Dafydd Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. A couple of quick notes before we get started. First of all, you may notice as you are coming in that we are recording this evening's broadcast for later broadcast on our YouTube channel. However, fear not, if you choose to have your camera on, we have the settings arranged so that it is only recording those of us who are unmuted and speaking in this lovely yellow box. So you will not be on YouTube for perpetuity. In light of that, please make use of the chat this evening for any questions that you have. We will be hosting an author question and answer session at the end of the evening. And any questions that you put into the chat, Dafydd and I will save them up and we will pose them for you at the end of the night. And then last of all, before Dafydd introduces our guest this evening, a note of thanks. Independent bookselling is a tough business in the best of times, and the last year and a half has certainly not been the best of times. And Northshire really owes its continued existence to the incredible loyalty and support of our customers, which means you. We couldn't do events like this and all the other things that we do without your incredible support, and we are deeply grateful for it. And now, without further ado, Dafydd, why don't you introduce our guest tonight?
Thank you so much, Rachel. It is my great pleasure to introduce Meredith Hall for her debut novel, Beneficence. Her previous book, the New York Times bestselling memoir Without a Map, is recognized as a contemporary classic of the memoir genre and was named a Book of the Year from Kirkus, BookSense, and Elle magazine. Her work has appeared in the Kenyon Review, the Southern Review, the New York Times, and elsewhere. Of her new novel, Richard Russo has said that if the word luminous didn't already exist, you'd have to invent it to describe Meredith Hall's radiant novel, Beneficence. While Danny Shapiro said that this fiercely beautiful novel took hold of me from the very first page, at once a page turner and an artistic triumph. And we are very lucky to be joined tonight by Joyce Maynard, author of 18 books, including the New York Times bestselling novel Labor Day and To Die For. A fellow McDowell, Colony, and Yaddo, she's been a reporter and columnist for the New York Times, a syndicated newspaper columnist whose domestic affairs column appeared in over 50 pages nationwide. Her latest novel, Count the Ways, was just published and has been called exhilaratingly brilliant, an extraordinarily generous invitation into a woman's intimate life, and that Maynard creates a world rich and real enough to hold the pain she fills it with. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Bookstore, Meredith Hall and Joyce Maynard.
Thank you very much.
It's such, to everybody here, I want to say that this is a particular gift, getting to talk to a writer who was new to me, both as a writer and very soon as a friend, Meredith. I have now read both books, Meredith, but I was really brought to awareness just last fall when I heard Meredith give a reading from Beneficence at a virtual event. And I was just knocked out. I ordered the book immediately. I read it in 2 days, and I consider it not only my favorite book of the year, but my favorite book of many years. It's a book that has stayed with me and inspired me, and also made me know that I wanted to know you. So we get to have this conversation, and we're inviting you all to join us. What a wonderful gift that is.
Well, thank you, Joyce. Joyce's profoundly beautiful novel, Count the Ways, has recently come out. And I have been very privileged to be in conversation twice now with Joyce about her book. So it's—
and there's still lots more to say, isn't there?
So much more to say.
We haven't actually met in person, but I'm so looking forward to it.
We have a chance tonight to cover a little more of that, territory.
I think Joyce and I. And the territory that we explore in our fiction, of course, is, as you know, so wedded. So rather than me tell about the book, I would love to ask you, Meredith, to describe the situation of beneficence. And I think maybe one approach to doing it might be to tell us where this story, this extraordinary story, came from. Besides your imagination.
Well, it was more than my imagination. I wrote my memoir, my first book, a long time ago. I was already an older writer when I wrote my memoir. I was in my 50s. I had been teaching writing in the MFA program at the University of New Hampshire for many years. And I hadn't considered writing. And I wrote my memoir. It came out into the world. It did very well. And it brought me around the country talking about not just the book, but about my life. It's a very intimate book. And that conversation was a very intimate conversation over and over and over again. And I made the decision after a couple of years that I was done and I wanted to move into fiction and find what I hoped would be some anonymity, some absence of me on the page. And so I started looking for my story, and I looked and I looked and I looked. I had no idea that it would take me so long to identify the book that I wanted to write. And it came to me one day in a very casual conversation with a neighbor in Maine. I lived in a very small town in a rural area. And this neighbor, Mark, happened to tell me a story about tragedy hitting a family that they knew when he was growing up. And he commented that the mother in this family went into herself. That's a very Maine expression. The mother went into herself. And then the father, as a result of that, made decisions that were very, ultimately, very questionable and maybe just plain harmful. And I thought I had my story. I recognized it right away. I thought, here is the moral ambiguity that I've been looking for. I wanted it to be hard to write. I wanted to have a hard time understanding my character.
Oh,
and
so important.
So I thought right away, this is it, I know. And I know now, although I was not aware of it at the time, I was estranged from my father all my life for many, many decades. And I think I saw in this character that I imagined, that I had heard about, I think I imagined somebody like my father who created a great deal of harm and never held himself accountable for it. And I wanted to explore how this man thinks about these things that he's done, these decisions that are so selfish and so harmful. But I started writing this book, and in fact, that is not the man that came to me and came to the page in any way. And I think there are still questions of moral ambiguity that Joyce and I might circle a little bit, but this is a very human person and a flawed human person.
I have a notepad here with just a list of, it could be 50 pages long, but I jotted down phrases that really spoke to me in the book. And right at the top is, this is from Beneficence, of course, we dwell in a complex and uncertain grace. I loved the complexity of this novel. Meredith, I love what you just said about the book being difficult. Whenever I hear a person saying that they just sort of knocked off a piece of writing, I feel then they lived on the surface, and this one is everything but that. But I want to ask you, this is a novel that follows a family through a stretch of years from about the mid-1940s, I guess, post-war, on a farm in Maine through about 1960. Following, as we have said, a terrible tragedy and the reverberations that nearly destroy their family and certainly alter it forever. I want to ask you, partly because, as you know, there's so much, I won't say similarity between our works, but we were exploring many similar kinds of themes, including—
Yes, we were.
Including
very in uncanny ways, Joyce.
Family and loss, and even having to do with loss having to do with a child. It is said by some people, and I have heard people say oh, that book is just too depressing. It's too sad. I'm not speaking of your book. It's actually, I've heard it said of mine. What do you say? What is the function of fiction? Is it our job to make the story, to locate a happy ending? Is it where do we come down with our responsibility as writers to a reader?
I think this is a wonderful question. For me, I made the decision that responsibility is to be honest and to portray human beings as we live our lives. There are very, very few people who don't know harm and loss and complexity, abandonment, betrayal. You know, we know these things, and to not write these things seems really a waste of effort. Readers, I don't think, are going to want to read this. When I first sat down with my editor, Josh Bodwell at Godine, he's just really very wonderful. I can't say enough about him. I said to him, I don't know if people are going to want to read such a dark book. And I loved his response. He was shocked. And he said, there's nothing dark about this book. This is not a dark book. A tragedy hits this family, but this is not a dark book. You bring hope and faith and belief in these people and in life onto every page in the book. And I think as a writer, that feels true. I feel that this is a book about love. It's a book about the grace that love brings to a family and holds families together, the grace that beautiful land, the beneficence of land, the generosity of land brings to us if we seek it. So for me, it's not a dark book.
Not for me either. Not for me either. For me, and I guess I'm somewhat answering the question for myself, that and why I love this book, that you take us to a very dark place and then you help us navigate through it, which to me is so much more meaningful and authentic than pretending that the dark places don't exist. You look square in the eye of one of the worst things that a family could go through, and then you lead us through the woods.
I think that that's the purpose. So in Count the Ways, there is never a time that the reader feels that this book is going to disintegrate into loss that the reader has to accept, that this life is gone and the reader has to accept it. You never put your reader in that position. You carry us forward constantly with a sense that somehow the light is going to return to this family.
I can see we're going to be tossing this ball back and forth all evening, because I say that's exactly what you do. I'm looking again at some of Meredith's greatest hits. I don't even know if they're the greatest hits. They're just ones that struck me. Love is not enough to help any of us now. And that's so much more real and honest than, love is all there is and all you need is love. Songs I love, but the stark truth of this book is these are people who love each other enormously, powerfully, and they're still in big trouble.
That's right. I made the decision, I think as a first novelist, a risky decision, that I wanted to try writing this book in 3 voices. So Tup, the father, and Doris, the mother, and one of the children, the middle child, Dodie, a girl, each have a voice, and they speak in turns. Doris, Dodie, Tup, Doris, Dodie, Tup, throughout this book over those couple decades. And one of the gifts that came to me as a writer in allowing these several voices was that they are constantly, even in their most difficult time, if they are not able to express their love and cohesion, their faith in the lastingness of that, they're longing for it. They're expressing great longing for that love that they know. They know it. It has been their life. And those 3 voices were helpful to me to to reaffirm again and again how powerful that love had been with them.
Did you know from the beginning, Meredith, that you wanted to employ this this method of storytelling that that shifted from one voice to another? I've done it myself. I did it in my novel To Die For, and it's not the usual choice. How did it come for you? Did you know that from the beginning?
Well, it's interesting. I know that there is that multiple voice novels have a reputation for being challenging and maybe not terribly successful. I really am happy that I did it. I went into this not realizing that I was, with it being my first book, I don't think I even knew how many questions I needed to ask about structure and form. And I thought that Tup was going to tell this story. I thought that this man would lead us through these events, and I wanted to hear how he explained things. That's, my ears were on him. And yet when I sat down to write, once I understood the territory I was in, I honestly felt a sense of shock that his wife Doris claimed that first page. She was the one who spoke, and it changed everything for me. It, first of all, made me understand immediately, as she spoke about her husband and her children and this farm, it made me understand that her love for Tup was profound, and her respect for him, her pleasure in him. They like each other, they're best friends. And I understood suddenly that she had a lot to teach me about this man. I was going to learn a lot as I listened to this wife talk about her husband. And then as Tup started to tell the story, and Dodie, I started to understand that for me as a writer, I liked moving. I liked moving through the complexity of both experience, different experiences, not just shared experience, but not shared experiences and differences of perspective. I loved it. I thought it really opened things for me as a writer.
And it just reminds us there is no one true story. There is that person's story. The novel is so many things. It's the story of a family. It's the story of a farm, a piece of land, a home. And it's really the story of a marriage too, and a marriage that was solid, is solid and immutable, but also strained to its limits, without giving away too much. If it's okay with you, Meredith, I will say a little bit about something that happened, so we can talk about something more. That a terrible event occurs in the family, which leads Doris, the wife, to absent herself from the family. She barely functions. We would now call it depression, but in those years, severe, profound depression. So she barely functions, and her daughter is left to step in, and husband to step in. And the husband makes an extraordinary choice that perhaps you would tell us what he does. And part of what I loved about it is that I came to understand his choice. You make the very best fiction writers make seemingly incomprehensible or unforgivable behavior comprehensible. You want to tell us what Tup does when his wife just checks out for years?
So Doris is, you're right, we would call this severe depression now. Doris's depression, there's a main expression, she went into herself. And Doris goes into herself. She barely functions. Of course, as a farm wife, they have a very successful small dairy farm in Maine that's been in Tup's family for many, many generations. They've brought the farm back to life after decades of decay. They work very hard, and they work very well together. And the absence, the loss of her work is very significant on this farm, and the absence of her parenting is a terrible burden, and becomes really Dodie's burden, this middle child's burden. Tup lives with this, trying to compensate for it, for a long time. This goes on for a very long time. Dodie grows up year by year and takes over more and more of these responsibilities. That breaks Tup's heart. He doesn't see that she's going to be able to be in school and do all that her mother is supposed to do, but she pulls it off. But Tup is lonely for his wife. He aches for his wife. And there is an ongoing sense on the parts of each of them that they are blamed by their partner, that they are guilty, that it was their fault that this thing happened. And eventually Tup just cannot live with that sense of blame and can't live in the terrible isolation that he's been feeling for several years. And he makes a very out of character decision that he's going to work nights in a mill nearby. And in the 40s and 50s, there were still a lot of functioning mills in the small towns. And he goes and takes care of equipment in the evening, through the night. And in doing that, meets a woman who owns this mill. And he starts living a double life. He moves between his life with Helen and his life at the farm. He gets up and is back at the farm by dawn every day, 7 days a week, and runs the farm. And a child comes from this relationship. And eventually, as the family, as the Tup and Doris family starts to heal and find its way back, all he's wanted during all of that is that family. And he really makes extremely hard decisions for us to encounter. He makes decisions that really leave this new life that he's formed. He really abandons it. And so the reader is left with great questions about what he's done and why he's done it and how we feel about it.
And even as he's doing it, even as he's doing this seemingly outrageous thing, there was for me a sense that this was part of his loyalty to his marriage. He doesn't allow himself to give his heart to this woman.
Yes.
This is nobody would mistake the story of this as a passionate love affair.
That's it.
There's a word, compartmentalized, that I don't particularly like. I don't like any words that end in IZE, but he has made this separate box that actually, one might argue, allows him to continue to function.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Joyce. I really appreciate that reading. And if we read this as a heartbreaking situation for Tup, in which he cannot replace his family, the only thing he wants is his wife. He is deeply in love and misses her terribly, and desperately wants for them to be able to pull this family back into shape and cohesion again. But loneliness drives him to this other place. And in the end, the question is, he just wanted his wife.
And this could be seen as morally reprehensible. What one could say, what was in it for that woman, and what an extraordinary violation of her heart, except that she does get something. She gets a child.
It's a child named Grace. Yes, she's an older woman, and she is a widow, and suddenly here in her life is this child that she's wanted. And so Tup is confused, feeling, well, you did get something, you got this child. And of course, Helen has many answers to that story. But this is for me the complex part of this story, that it is not easy to explain and justify Tup's decisions. And I think that there is a story waiting in Helen and Grace and their experiences, because neither of them have a voice in this story. But Tup has protested to himself and to the reader throughout this book, I am a good man, but I am a good man. He tells us this again and again, even in the face of these decisions he's making. And I hope the reader wrestles with that.
He also says, I see that I am no hero. And nobody is hero or villain in this story, which makes it very real.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, and this might seem to be backtracking a little, but as somebody who herself has published both memoir and fiction, for me, the experience of publishing also a painfully honest memoir, a dangerous memoir, as yours was in certain ways, without a trace. I have always said that was what allowed me to continue on and write fiction, because I had freed myself of the story that was haunting me. I want to know if it was like that for you. I'm having now read both of these fabulous books. I'm sort of astounded that there were that many years when you weren't publishing books, but I would think that the floodgates would now be opening.
This is very, I wrote my novel having no sense whatsoever that it had a thing in the world to do with me. Once I understood that Tup was not going to be a man modeled on my father who, that I wanted to explore that. Once I abandoned that, I felt that I was working entirely in the world of imagination. And I can see now, stepping back, that there are, of course, similarities in these stories that
come and get you every time, don't they? You swear you're not going to, that it's not going to be you, and then you crop up in those.
Well, the thing that was wonderful for me is that it was readers, when the book first came out, readers who started asking me awkward questions about those shared experiences. I had no idea. I wrote freely. I was so just so pleased to be free of those stories, and wrote completely outside my own. I don't know any people like these people. I've never lived that life. I don't have any, I had to make it up. It was all made up. And so it is a surprise to me that, of course, my stories filter in. But I do think that had I started with fiction, perhaps I still would have needed to write my story, and that would have been that first fiction. So that's an interesting question. Yeah.
The story, as we've said, is set on a farm, and it rang so true that I assumed you must have lived on a farm. It also takes place over years before you were born.
Yes.
Many of them. I almost it felt sort of otherworldly, the way you had channeled these people.
And channeling is a great word for it. I did not grow up on a dairy farm. I don't know much at all about dairy farming, but I have again and again had the experience while I wrote this book that I was writing a life that I desperately wish had been mine. This is a nostalgia that I've carried my entire life. And I think that I just had an absolutely exuberant experience of creating that life. I love that house. I love that family in that house. I love that barn and the fields and the creek and the apple orchard and the beautiful pine hill at the distance on the far side of the pasture where family members going back generations are buried. I simply wrote home. And
it makes such a difference. One time and one time only, I wrote about a series of characters I deeply disliked. It was actually a true crime book, and it was uncomfortable going to my laptop every morning because I didn't want to spend time with those people. Yes. And just the inverse is true, I think, with Beneficence. You can feel your love and your pleasure in lingering over not even just the sights of this farm, but the sounds and the smells. Oddly enough, I'm in the middle of reading Charlotte's Web out loud at the moment to somebody, and who has never heard it. And I was thinking about your book as I was reading that, but E.B. White lived on a farm. You did not.
Yes, that's true. Joyce, count the ways you have done the same thing. There is the reader senses this writer's love for this place. This is a place known and loved by this writer, even if it is not a house or a town you've ever known before. We are filled with it's a reassurance. There's a strong sense of reassurance that this writer has written. This is in many ways a love story to this place and to this young family. And I know that there are sort of factual similarities between this place and your life, but I also know that this is fiction. You have invented these people and invented this life. But there is for you too a sense that you sort of wrote your way home to this place that might have made you happy someplace along the way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've got another line from you, Meredith, that I'll read. And it makes me think about, again, I'm going back to that word love, and which we throw around with too much ease sometimes. And we make it out that love is all rainbows and stars and, tweeting birds, but love can also break your heart. And you say, I always believed that love is joy, that if we are bound by love, we are assured grace, but it has assured us only of itself. That was a line that I underlined and went back to many times, that the love is on every page of this book. That does not mean happily ever after is on every page.
Yes, yes. Often that love is an ache.
Yeah,
yes, that's right. The title of this book, Beneficence, while I was writing this book, the family name is Center. This farm is the Center farm in the Center family for these generations. And so I always refer to it.
Center spelled Center, but of course, when we hear it, we think of the center too.
Yes, that's right. So
the center does not hold.
That's right. Well, I always referred to it as the center place. And when Godine took this book, Josh Bodwell said, I'm not comfortable with it. People are going to think that this is Center. And he roamed around, I roamed around and looking for a title. And he came to me and said, I think the perfect title for this book is Beneficence. And I was uneasy with it. I like the idea of it, but I thought, really, how did he come up with this word? It's a word from someplace. And I couldn't attach myself to it. And then shortly after that, I worked through the book with some short copy edits and was shocked to come across the word beneficence on the page. And I realized, oh, I wrote that word. That word was important to me. And I came across it again 50 pages later and thought this word was very important to me. And I did a word search. I used the word beneficence in this book 4 times. And I quickly came to understand that really this book is about a kind of love that is beneficence, that it is a goodness that I believe that we all carry. And it's a longing that we all carry. I think we desire to live with each other in beneficence. And this family's struggle from a state of grace, a kind of idyllic life through this terrible tragedy, and then back out on the other side towards a return to that beneficence. For me, that is the kind of love that this book is about.
Yes. You mentioned earlier, we were talking about the character of Helen, who would not be regarded by most people, by most readers, as a main character in the book. She comes up rather late, and her child Grace, who is an even less significant character, but I'm haunted by them. And I wanted to ask you a question that actually gets asked of me a lot, very often. When a person has loved a novel of mine, they ask me, please write a sequel. And mostly I think that's just about they love the book and they didn't want it to be over, and the sequel doesn't apply. But I love this book, and I felt absolutely a sequel did need to be written. And I wanted to ask you about that.
Well, I have always wondered about sequels, wondering who might be motivated to write a sequel. I don't read books in series generally, but I have to say that not only, I hope do readers wish this book would not end when they're done with it. But I find that I was very reluctant to end this book, and I still live inside this book.
I know that feeling. It's so sad.
Really a problem. This is really a problem. I am still too much in this book. And there are people in this book that feel important to me, although they did not have a place on the page really. And one of those is this child, Grace. She's a child who was the product of a very uneasy relationship, certainly not an ideal relationship for her to come from. And I'm interested in that child. The reader will learn that Tup carries a profound sense of responsibility to that child, but he does leave her and returns to his family. And so I wonder what their relationship in the future might be. Does he invite her into his life? What happens to the rest of the family?
And also, I was thinking about Daniel. I understand if you haven't read the book, this name will mean nothing, but I will convey that Daniel is a friend of one of the children who is present at the terrible event, at the moment of the terrible event. And he too is scarred. There are these ripples over everybody's life. And he is one who is not technically a member of the family, but he is in the family of grief. And he becomes a member of the family, of course.
Yes, he does. And he plays a very central role. He is ultimately the person who sort of shakes Doris and Tup out of their sense of guilt and self-blame, anger, loneliness, and says, this was a tragedy. Call this what it was. It was a tragedy. And it's time to move on from that tragedy. But yes, Daniel had a very interesting childhood. We know that when he comes into this family. And also the youngest child in the family, Beston, is a silent child in this book. And we leave him when he has moved to Boston, a very young, very, very young boy living on his own in Boston, and a musician and working in a printer's shop. And he interests me. He never had a chance to tell any of his story. So I don't know. Joyce, you think about this. I know you must. You have people in this book that still have life.
And letting go of characters is so painful. They become a part of your world, and suddenly you get to the last page, and where did they go? You were used to spending your days with them. I'm sure we're going to get to questions, so I hope everybody's beginning to think about them. But I have to ask you, I just want to talk about motherhood with you, Meredith. I want to talk about what is this phrase that comes up, a good mother. She was a good mother. She was a bad mother. By all kinds of measures, Doris has been a bad mother. She has failed in her responsibilities. She doesn't take care of her family. Emotionally, she cuts out. What is this book saying? And I'll just read one line. It's from very early on in the book. When you have a child, your own life diminishes to just about nothing, and willingly so. And I think there's another place where she says, I can't read that because it'll give something away. This is a woman who's given everything to her children, and then the bottom drops out. So who is she? What are you saying about motherhood, and where do you land in that give everything and preserve oneself, which is the more contemporary view, certainly?
Yeah, that for me is a contemporary view. It seems to me that Doris is, she's in the beginning of the story, before this event happens, this loss hits her, Doris is a wonderful mother. She takes care of the house. The gardens are their food. That is their food supply. She gets all of that into the house for the winter every year.
And she's stable. She's safe. You feel the sense of safety and constancy. Nobody ever wonders, is she going to be there or not? She's always there.
And she's happy. She's a very fulfilled woman. She grew up in a small town in Maine. Her father was a shopkeeper, and she grew up helping in that shop and always imagined that would be her life. And then a charming top center walked across her path, and that was it. She moved onto the farm with this young man, and knowing nothing about farming. And it was a decrepit farm at that point. It had really gone into decay. And she and Top did all this hard work, right away had children. They had one and then another child. And she was content at a very, very deep level. She had enough sense to question this life. Is this what I like? Is this what I want? And her answer again and again was absolutely, this is fulfillment. But what interests me about Doris is that I don't think Doris ever felt that she handed herself over to her children. I think Doris felt all her life that she lived in a reciprocal relationship with her children, and that whatever she was required to give to them, they brought back to her in such a deep and honest and respectful relationship, full of such pleasure. They just liked each other. They liked being with each other. And I don't have the sense that Doris ever felt that she lost her life in any way to her children. I think that she felt that her children were 3 more human beings who moved into her house, and she found them absolutely the best people she wanted to hang around with, along with her husband. Yeah. I think there are very big questions about once she went into herself in that expression. I think there are very large questions about whether this is a failure on the part of this woman. And I personally did not write her seeing her in that way. I felt great compassion for the kind of the force, the enormity of the tragedy, how large the tragedy was to do this to her. And I felt great compassion for her. I got frustrated with her. Certainly her child Dodie and her husband expressed great frustration when she was not able to find her way out of it.
And that's part of our job, isn't it? To if we just made you feel good all the time, there'd be no conflict, and yes, it wouldn't keep you turning the page. You're meant to be a little upset sometimes. I'm seeing a message from Rachel that says we've got some questions, and of course,
okay, great.
It's great when that happens.
I do. I've got one to start us off. Meredith, I was wondering, what are some of the challenges of using Maine as a setting? I mean, how do you make it so distinct, like a character?
Well, I know Maine and love Maine. I've lived my entire life, my entire adult life there. I think I have Maine in my blood. My family along the way did genealogical studies, and having thought that none of us had ever been in Maine, it turns out that everybody going back generations is from Maine. So that was a wonderful surprise. Maine is known to me, and it just feels, it is home. I remember when I was young and married, my husband and I crossed over the border and made our way up to Newcastle, Maine, and sat a little house there. And I remember walking in and saying, this place, Maine, is home. And so I know it. And I also, the land is something, land and the beauty of this planet and the generosity of this planet is something that carries me every day. It's something that is very, very deeply, it's a spiritual experience in many ways for me, very, very important to me. And I wrote my love for the beauty of that land and my faith in the goodness of that land and the bounty of that land. I wrote that love. It really is in many ways a love story to place. Yeah.
That's really lovely. Audience members, please type any questions that you have in the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I actually have one of my own, which is, Meredith, when we first got on this evening and we're getting set up and getting ready to go, you and I talked briefly about the ways in which really both your novel and Joyce's are ones that kind of are what our spirits need right now in this rough time that we're all having collectively. And I wondered if you could both expand on that a little bit, the emotional resonance of your work in this pandemic year.
Joyce, I'm going to give that to you.
Well, we've all spent a lot of time at home lately, haven't we? And Count the Ways is very much a book about home, about finding home, searching, yearning for a home. My character grows up in a in a house that's not really a home. She finds a home, she makes a home with her family, and then she loses her home, and she loses her footings when she loses her home. And I did like you, Meredith, you know, I was in love with that piece of land and that house. I knew every nook and cranny of it, and I could walk it. I could imagine all the spaces. And I think it's really important to be able to do that. In the last year, the world for most of us has gotten much smaller, and we've had to go inward to home. So it felt like I actually finished the last draft of Count the Ways during the 6 months of the pandemic. The first 6 months of the pandemic, I'd been working on the novel for 3 years, but those 6 months really were when the book came together for me. And I know that the pandemic deeply influenced my sense of the importance of the small inner world that we create in our home. How about you?
And I would also add to that, I think that a normal instinct might be people already are living in great distress. There is so much wrong. There is so much worrying us. There's such weight on our shoulders. So we better not touch on any of that. And I think that, in fact, saying that life is here, even with the pandemic, our personal and private emotional lives, our histories are ongoing. And to say, in the midst of all of this, there is love, and there is death, and there is blame, and there is guilt, and there is loneliness, terrible isolation, there is helplessness. And to name these things, which we all are still feeling, even with the extra weight of the pandemic, I think feels like a very human story. I think that if we could escape our homes right now and join the way we might have at one time a generation ago or 2 generations ago around a table and tell stories. Well, if we gathered, we would tell stories, and those stories would not be just about the good times. Let's not talk about any difficulties because there's a big drought on and we're worried about our crops. People would have told stories about neighbors dying and uncles sick and children who had a terrible accident, lost a leg. We would tell these stories. And I think there is something very reassuring to us about the ongoingness of those human stories, that we know them. We lie in our beds at night living these stories. We understand them. They never stop. And I think having somebody put it on a page and say, yes, this is still life, and these things still happen. And out of this comes love and loss and fear, loneliness, all these things that we're so familiar with. But in the end, we seem to make our way. In the end, we manage to make our way. So it feels to me as if it's not a bad thing to tell a difficult story right now.
If you live through pain and make nothing of it, then that really is a tragedy. But to me, the question is what you do with your pain, what you do with your loss, and what you do with, and in this case, of course, this wasn't thankfully a memoir of things that had happened to you, but you are looking at loss and grief and pain and conflict in a family and making something of meaning out of it, which redeems the experience. It's everything I look for in a book and everything I try to give when I write one.
I think that's why readers come to books. I think readers are saying, well, your story isn't going to match mine exactly, but I bet I'm going to find some of myself in here. And I'll find it reassuring to see that people make their way through this. They figure it out in some way. Sometimes characters don't. Sometimes characters fail to make their way, but we also know that too. We all have those personal experiences too. So,
yes.
We
are asking questions, but I'd much rather to
yes,
hear from you.
We don't have any audience questions, so I have one or Dafydd has one, but Joyce, if you have one, I'm sure it's better than either of them. So why don't you go ahead and ask our last question? So,
Meredith, among the many things that we have in common, we both, in addition to writing our own work, we both teach writing or have taught. You had a long career as a teacher, primarily of nonfiction, I think,
Yes.
and I likewise of memoir. And I'm guessing that there are people listening right now who, whatever level of aspiration, whether it is to publish a book or, have an essay in New York Times Modern Love, who are drawn to the act of writing. And because you taught for so long, and I can tell just from listening, you would have been a wonderful teacher. What would you say to people who might be in our gallery right now about where to find their story, where to begin? I have my own, of course, but I want to hear yours.
So I believe that we carry memory. If we're talking about writing memoir, which is what I taught, we carry memory with us every minute. We are loaded with memory, and the brain is such a fabulous filing system of these memories. And so one exercise that I have asked students and workshop people to do for many years is to make a list. Charles Simic, the poet, said in one of his essays, a beautiful essay, I circle my obsessive images.
I say the same thing.
Do you? This is hilarious, Joyce.
And I actually say, write them down. And I say, you might not have to. You might think you don't need to because they are obsessive, and they haunt you all too much. But yes, write them down.
That's hilarious. So he says, making meaning is the matter of my existence. And these obsessive images we carry them all our lives. And I ask people simply to keep a notebook and start writing down these memories, these images. They are images. And to return to this list again and again. And I personally found when I first started doing this, that some of them a month later or a year later meant nothing to me. I wasn't even sure what I was referring to, but then others would tumble out.
And sometimes they're odd. Sometimes they're really odd, particular little things. My Count the Ways begins, as you know, with a memory that the mother has of when her children were very young. And it's something that I did with my children of the very first weekend that the snow melted and the brooks were running their fastest. She makes little paper boats with her children to sail down the river, the brook. And one of her children insists you can't sail an empty boat. You've got to make the people. So they start making little people out of corks, cork people. Actually, the novel was originally called The Cork People. And it's just this odd little memory of making these cork people and sailing these cork people. But in fact, what I came to realize was, and I didn't even know it at the time that I was sailing the cork people, is that it's a metaphor for so much of parenthood. Those obsessions will inform your story, and they will lead you if you trust and never disavow them and say that's just a crazy obsession. It's your obsession. There's no such thing as a wrong obsession.
That's exactly right. And then I would suggest to you, if you make this list, if you want to start writing some of these stories, choose anything off that list and start once, comma, and then tell us a story. Once, comma, and that will open your door. So have fun. I hope you do it.
Yes. You truly are my long lost sister.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Joyce. It's really been wonderful.
Joyce, Meredith, thank you so much. This has been a lovely evening, and thank you for making this beautiful space with us tonight. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you
all for coming, for joining us. We couldn't have a party without you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you and good night. Take care, everybody.